This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Go to the link in the description below so they know that I sent you. Hello everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and it is Friday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. This week we're taking a break from the usual kind of lists I do, those that are made up of cards objectively chosen based on their tournament performance, and instead we're doing a more subjective list. This week, I'm giving you my 10 picks for the most confusing cards in all of Magic. These days, Wizards prides themselves in creating cards that are easy to understand, but in the early days of the game, it seems like the designers were having a competition to see who could design the most confusing card. Basically, to make this list, a card had to be so confusing that generally, you have to read it multiple times to fully understand it, and most of these are so confusing that even after you have learned what it does, you're going to have to read it multiple times the next time you see it too. Cards on this list all have oracle text too that is supposed to make the card easier to understand, but the things these cards do are so complicated that for most of them, even oracle text doesn't help very much. Now, let's get started with the list. At number 10, I have Dead Ringers. This one is sort of sneakily confusing as it has way fewer words on it than any other cards that are on this list. It also has oracle text that is identical to the printed text, which is not the case with any other cards on this list. However, the few words that are on it make it pretty difficult to quickly ascertain what it does. So, what can this kill exactly? Well, it can kill any two creatures that are not black, assuming they are both identical in terms of their colors. If the two targets are two colors, they have to be both of those colors or it doesn't work. Also worth noting that you can't cast this at all if your opponent has only one creature in play, as it requires two targets. Imagine this getting printed at common in a limited format today. There'd be a ton of chaos. My favorite thing about our number 9 confusing card, Remove Enchantments, is that it has the kind of name where you feel like you can probably guess what it does. Surely it can't be complicated. It probably just destroys all enchantments, right? No, it's way more complicated than that. Basically, what they wanted to do with this card is make it so that it blows up auras your opponent is using, either to buff their creatures or weaken yours. Instead of just having this say destroy all auras with enchant creature that your opponent controls, they decided to have this do some pretty weird stuff. Namely, it returns all of your enchantments and auras to your hand, getting them out of the way of the effect, and then blows up your opponent's auras. This is made even more confusing if you're looking at the original text, where the fact that you remove your auras from your creature and the fact that they are then returned to your hand are separated by another sentence, making it kind of confusing if you're trying to go through this complex card step by step. Obviously, the oracle text on this clears that up some, making it clear from the beginning that you return them to your hand. But it still isn't exactly a straightforward card. Once you figure out on your 6th or 7th read-through what this does, it does actually seem like kind of a sweet way to blow out opponents who are playing a bunch of auras, to weaken your creatures and to make theirs stronger, assuming they're attacking with them. If you play it, it certainly will shock and confuse your opponent, I'll tell you that much. At number 8, I have Time and Tide, but it is really standing in for all the cards in the game that have phasing. I decided this was the most confusing of the bunch. So, phasing is a really difficult to understand mechanic because it is unintuitive and it does something so incredibly unique that it's pretty difficult to figure it out. So here is the reminder text for phasing. This phases in or out before you untap during each of your untap steps. While it's phased out, it is treated as though it doesn't exist. So, basically, cards with phasing don't exist on the battlefield, but their phasing in or out does not trigger things like enter the battlefield or leaves the battlefield triggers. This is because the cards never leave the battlefield. They just aren't capable of doing anything on turns where they are phased out. Then you have Time and Tide here, which lets you turn all of that phasing on its head, I guess. But yeah, this mechanic is difficult to understand. I can't tell you the number of times I've seen people think that phasing is just like a temporary exile effect, which is kind of what has gone on to replace phasing, and I think we should be really glad that that's the case. At number 8, I have Wall of Caltrops, another card that is standing in for an entire confusing mechanic, in this case, banding. The wall is the most confusing of the bunch because it also has some super confusing requirements to actually gain the ability to band. Before we get into that though, let's look at banding's reminder text, the length of which is a pretty good indicator of how complex the card is and how confusing it is. It has 55 words of reminder text, and what it says is this: any creatures with banding, and up to one without, can attack in a band. Bands are blocked as a group. If any creature with banding you control are blocking or being blocked by a creature, you divide that creature's combat damage, not its controller, among any of the creatures it's being blocked by or is blocking. That clears up everything, right? I mean, the Oracle text can't possibly be confusing and difficult to understand, except, that it is. To unpack this a little, banding lets you choose to attack with 2 or more creatures as a unit. If they get blocked, both creatures' attack is blocked, which is obviously a downside. But the upside is that you get to choose how the blocking creature does damage to your band. You can do the same thing when you block with a band. This means that you can really screw up combat for your opponent. Plus, they are probably going to have to look up the Oracle reminder text for banding to even understand what is going on, and that sounds like a lot of fun. And we haven't even talked about how this particular creature gains banding yet. So Wall of Caltrops is a wall payoff of sorts. If you block with this and another wall, it gains banding until end of turn. So the design for this particular card is kind of interesting. Obviously, a 2/1 wall is horrendous, but if this teams up with other walls, it can do some damage while you redirect the combat damage from your opponent to your higher toughness walls. Doesn't that make you want to build a wall tribal deck? At number 6, I have Raging River. This is a card whose original text is hilariously confusing. For one thing, Raging River refers to itself in its card text when it says when you attack, non-flying defending creatures must be divided as opponent wishes between the left and right sides of the river, and for some reason, river is also capitalized. After your opponent does that, you have to think about which side of the river to put your attackers on because creatures can only block creatures who are on the same side of the river as they are. In this case, I do think the Oracle text admittedly clears things up a little bit, but what this card does is so strange that understanding it on the first read-through seems pretty challenging. I do actually think the design on the card is kind of cool and actually pretty neat flavor-wise. If you think of it sort of as deploying your forces, it sort of makes you commit them to one side or the other of a river, and then your opponent gets to decide which side of the river they send their attackers. I think that's kind of cool flavor-wise. At number 5, we have another card that messes around with how blocking works, and that's Camouflage. Turns out effects that do that are pretty confusing since we're only 5 cards into this list, and 3 of them have something to do with blocking. This is another classic example of a card whose Oracle text doesn't do a whole lot in terms of making it less confusing. In fact, the Oracle text on this one actually asks you to do things completely different from the original text. The idea is to make it so your opponent doesn't know which of your creatures they are blocking, since your creatures, now have camouflage. The original card accomplished this by having the attacker put their creatures face down and shuffle them around, but the Oracle text instead has the defending player make piles of creatures, and then each of those piles then randomly blocks an attacking creature. In some ways, the original way this card worked might actually have been easier than the Oracle text version. The original way was certainly more flavorful. At number 4 is Chains of Mephistopheles. Like Dead Ringers, this doesn't have a completely enormous text box, at least not when compared to the other cards on this list, but you do have to read the few words that it does have very carefully to fully understand what it is this card does. The Oracle text makes things easier here, but I have a feeling the first time you play this against your opponent, you're going to have to read it over and over again every time they draw a card since it is so difficult to understand what this thing does. So, here's the rundown. If a player tries to draw more than just the card in their draw step, they have to discard a card from their hand. Then, they get to draw a card. If they can't discard a card, the top card of their library goes into their graveyard. This card is made simpler by using common Magic Sling. Basically, if you would draw an extra card, you rummage instead. If you can't rummage, you mill the top card of your library. Too bad they don't use those terms on the card itself. At number 3, we have what is probably one of the more disliked cards in all the game, Scheherazade. Usually when I talk about this card, I have people tell me I'm pronouncing it incorrectly, but I'm actually pronouncing it a little more closely to the actual Arabic where this card comes from. Anyway, this is one that has admittedly been drastically improved by Oracle text, but the card is still bizarre and unintuitive. The original text actually did a better job of explaining what the effect was. That is, after you figured out what the heck the card said. The Oracle text doesn't fill in the blanks for you very much. I mean, what is a sub-game anyway? What else are you going to use for your deck if not your library, right? Basically, a sub-game in this case means that you leave the main game you are playing as is. The board state remains the same and all of the cards that have been played, whether in the graveyard, on the battlefield, in exile, or whatever, remain a part of that game. You don't shuffle them into your deck. You just start a new game without those cards. You basically play a new game as if the other did not exist at all. Then, after you and your opponent have wasted time playing an entire other game, Scheherazade makes it so that the loser loses half of their life. That's right, that whole other game was as long as a normal game, but you may as well have only played half of one. This card is actually a pretty big flavor win mostly, since it's based on a character in the 9th century work of Arabic literature called 1001 Nights, sometimes also called Arabian Nights. In it, Scheherazade is telling all of the stories contained in the anthology, and she tells a new one every night. This is because her husband, a king, has been marrying a new woman every night and having her executed the next morning. She keeps telling him a new story every night to avoid this fate. So basically, she's stalling, and that's what this card does. Now, the fact that it's not a creature is kind of weird, but hey, at least it's a flavor win somewhat. Anyway, because what Scheherazade does is so obnoxious and makes matches last so long, it is currently the only card that isn't an anti-card or a manual dexterity card that is entirely banned in Vintage, a format where they usually like to restrict cards to one copy at the least. That goes a long way towards telling you how much of a menace this card is. Alright, we're in the top 2 now. The cards we've looked at so far have been confusing, but I think the top 2 cards on this list are on their own level in terms of how confusing they are. At number 2, I have Illusionary Mask. This is a card that has longer oracle text than it does original printed text. So what does this do exactly? Well, you can use this activated ability to put a creature with converted mana cost less than or equal to the X you pay for that ability. And when you use that ability, you get to put it into play kind of the way you would a morph creature. It's face down and it's a 2/2. But this is way more complicated than morph. For one thing, the X you pay actually pays attention to the color of mana you use, so you can't just pay colorless mana. You have to pay the type of mana you would already pay to play the creature to begin with. You also have to take note of the kind of mana you use to play the thing face down, because your opponent doesn't get to see it, but they have to be able to verify later on that the creature you played could legally be played with the mana you spent. This isn't something that is immediately obvious about the card. The way the card plays as a blocker actually feels somewhat morph-like in that you get to block with it and your opponent may suddenly be attacking into a much larger face-up creature. It doesn't work that well on attacks though, since the mask makes the creature turn face-up the moment it becomes tapped, so unless you're giving it vigilance, your opponent will know what it is. Basically, the morph mechanic, which was introduced much later, is a way better and more interesting version of this effect, and it doesn't involve nearly as many words. So yes, this card is super confusing. But you know what's the most confusing card in the history of the game? For me, it's Ice Cauldron, which I have at number 1. Like Illusionary Mask, it's an artifact with an X ability that makes you write down the kind of mana you use for the ability. In this case, you add a charge counter to the Cauldron and exile a card from your hand. Like Illusionary Mask, you have to write down what mana you used for X, what color, and everything. After that, though, the Cauldron diverges from what the Mask does. You can cast the card you exile with the Cauldron, but keep in mind, unlike most effects like this you see, you have to spend the mana again to cast the spell. In addition to that already confusing chunk of text, the Ice Cauldron can also function as an incredibly convoluted mana rock that uses the charge counter you added to it and adds mana to your mana pool equal to the exiled card's mana cost. However, it isn't like you can use it to make a massive amount of mana super quickly, since you have to pay the X just to exile the card in the first place. So yeah, what makes this more confusing than the Mask for me is that it has 2 different and very confusing effects instead of just one. Well, that does it for this week's MTG Top 10. Next week, I'll be back with one of my more traditional lists that looks at Magic's competitive history to rank the cards. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to binge watch a bunch of other MTG Top 10s, I've got you covered, because there are over 150 of them. You should see the playlist for them on this screen. Thanks for watching.